The Junkers Ju-88 was a German World War II Luftwaffe twin-engined multirole combat aircraft, designed by Junkers Flugzeug and Motorenwerke in the mid-1930s to be a so-called Schnellbomber, which would be too fast for any of the fighters of its era to intercept. It suffered from a number of technical problems during the later stages of its development and early operational roles, but became one of the most versatile combat aircraft of the war. Like a number of other Luftwaffe bombers, it was used successfully as a bomber, dive bomber, night fighter, torpedo bomber, reconnaissance aircraft, heavy fighter, and even, during the closing stages of the conflict in Europe, as a flying bomb. Despite its protracted development, the aircraft became one of the Luftwaffe's most important assets. The assembly line ran constantly from 1936 to 1945, and more than 16,000 Ju-88s were built in dozens of variants, more than any other twin-engine German aircraft of the period. Throughout the production, the basic structure of the aircraft remained unchanged. Design and development. In August 1935, the German Ministry of Aviation submitted its requirements for an unarmed, three-seat, high-speed bomber, with a payload of 800 to 1,000 kilograms. Design of the Ju-88 began with the study EF-59, which evolved into two parallel designs, Ju-85 and Ju-88. The Ju-85 was a twin-engined bomber aircraft prototype, designed by Junkers in 1935. The Reich Air Ministry requested the aircraft, which differed from the Ju-88 due to the use of a twin fintail unit. The aircraft was never put into service. Design was initiated by Junkers chief designer Ernst Zindel. He was assisted by Wilhelm Heinrich Evers and American engineer Alfred Gassner. Evers and Gassner had worked together at Fokker Aircraft Corporation of America, where Gassner had been chief engineer. Junkers presented their initial design in June 1936, and were given clearance to build two prototypes. The first two aircraft were to have a range of 2,000 kilometers and were to be powered by two DB600s. Three further aircraft, work number 4,943, 4,944 and 4,945, were to be powered by Jumo 211 engines. The first two prototypes, Ju-88 V1 and V2, differed from the V3, V4 and V5 in that the latter three models were equipped with three defensive armament positions to the rear of the cockpit, and were able to carry two 1,000 kg bombs, one under each inner wing panel. The first five prototypes had conventionally operating dual-strut leg rearwards retracting main gear, but starting with the V6 prototype, a main gear design debuted that twisted the new, single-leg main gear strut through 90 degrees during the retraction sequence, much like that of the American Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighter. This feature allowed the main wheels to end up above the lower end of the strut when fully retracted, and was adopted as standard for all future production Ju-88s, and only minimally modified for the later Ju-188 and 388 developments of it. These single-leg landing gear struts also made use of stacks of conical Belleville washers inside them, as the main form of suspension for takeoffs and landings. By 1938, radical modifications from the first prototype began to produce a heavy dive bomber. The wings were strengthened, dive brakes were added, the fuselage was extended, and the number of crewmen was increased to 4. Due to these advances, the Ju-88 was to enter the war as a medium bomber. The choice of annular radiators for engine cooling on the Ju-88, which placed these radiators immediately forward of each engine and directly behind each propeller, allowed the cooling lines for the engine coolant and oil cooling cooling radiators to be just about as short as possible, with integral port and starboard air intakes for cooling the exhaust headers. The starboard inlet also supplying the inlet air for the Dumo 211's characteristic starboard side supercharger location. The concept may have led to a number of other German military aircraft designs adopting the same solution, such as the Arado R240, Heinkel He-177, Heinkel He-219, the inline-powered developments of the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and the twin-engine Focke-Wulf TAR-154, as well as being an engine accessory design feature that made it easier to unitize an aircraft power plant into a pre-packaged form, done shortly after the war's start, that likely led to the adoption of what came to be called the Kraft Air Unitized Engine Installation concept for inline and radial aviation engines, adopted by German twin and multi-engined aircraft during the war years. The aircraft's first flight was made by the prototype Ju-88V1, which bore the civil registration DAQEN on the 21st of December 1936. When it first flew, it managed about 580 km/h, and Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was ecstatic. It was an aircraft that could finally fulfill the promise of the Schnellbomber, a high-speed bomber. The streamlined fuselage was modeled after its contemporary, the Dornier 17, but with fewer defensive guns because the belief still held that it could outrun late 1930s era fighters. The fifth prototype set a 1,000 km closed-circuit record in March 1939, carrying a 2,000 kg payload at a speed of 517 km/h. However, by the time Luftwaffe planners like Ernst Udet had their opportunities to their own pet features added, the Ju-88's top speed had dropped to around 450 km/h. The Ju-88V7 was fitted with cable-cutting equipment to combat the potential threat of British barrage balloons, and was successfully tested in this role. The V7 then had the Ju-88A1 Beetle's unfaceted nose glazing installed, complete with the Bowler undernose ventral defensive machine gun emplacement, and was put through a series of dive-bombing tests with 250 kg and 500 kg bombs, and in early 1940, with 1,000 kg bombs. The Ju-88V8 flew on 3 October 1938. The A0 series was developed through the V9 and V10 prototypes. The A1 series prototypes were WRKNRS 0003, 0004 and 0005. The A1s were given the Dumo 211B1AG power plants. Dr. Heinrich Koppenberg assured Göring in the autumn of 1938 that 300 Ju-88s per month was definitely possible. Göring was in favor of the A1 variant for mass production. Production was delayed drastically by developmental problems, although planned for a service introduction in 1938. The Ju-88 finally entered squadron service on the first day of the attack on Poland in 1939. Production was painfully slow, with only one Ju-88 manufactured per week, as problems continually kept cropping up. The Ju-88C series of heavy fighter was also designed very early in 1940, but kept secret from Göring, as he only wanted bombers. Dive bomber. In October 1937, General Luftschutzmeister Ernst Udet had ordered the development of the Ju-88 as a heavy dive bomber. This decision was influenced by the success of the Ju-87 Stuka in this role. The Junkers Development Center at Dessau gave priority to the study of pull-out systems and dive brakes. The first prototype to be tested as a dive bomber was the Ju-88V4, followed by the V5 and V6. These models became the planned prototype for the A1 series. The V5 made its maiden flight on 13 April 1938, and the V6 on 28 June 1938. Both the V5 and V6 were fitted with 4-blade propellers, an extra bomb bay and a central control system. As a dive bomber, the Ju-88 was capable of pinpoint deliveries of heavy loads. However, despite all the modifications, dive bombing still proved too stressful for the airframe, and in 1943, tactics were changed so that bombs were delivered from a shallower, 45 degrees diving angle. Aircraft and bomb sights were accordingly modified and dive brakes were removed. With an advanced Stuvy dive bomb sight, accuracy remained very good for its time. Maximum bomb load of the A4 was 3,000 kilograms, but in practice, standard bomb load was 1,500 to 2,000 kilograms. Junkers later used the A4 airframe for the A-17 torpedo carrier. However, the variant lacked the undernose bowler gondola for a ventral gun position. Fighter bomber. The Ju-88C series of standard fighter bomber versions from the C2 onwards culminated in the Ju-88C6, applying experience acquired with the A4 bomber, equipped with the same Ju-Mode 211J engines but replacing the Beetle's nose glazing with a smoothly curved all-metal nose, pierced only by the barrels of its forward-firing offensive armament. The C6 was used mostly as fighter bomber and therefore assigned to bomber units. As a reaction to the increasing number of attacks on German shipping, especially on U-boats in the Bay of Biscay, from July 1942 it started flying anti-shipping patrols and escort-in missions from bases in France. V. Kampfgeschwader 40 being formed to operate the C6. The aircraft of V. KG-40 were a significant threat to the anti-submarine aircraft and operated as escort fighters for the more vulnerable Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor maritime patrol bombers. Between July 1942 and July 1944, the Ju-88s of KG-40 and ZG-1 were credited with 109 confirmed air-to-air victories at a cost of 117 losses. They were finally deployed against the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, incurring heavy losses for little effect before being disbanded on 5 August 1944. Attack bomber. The Ju-88P was a specialized variant for ground attack and to function as a bomber-destroyer, designed starting from 1942 and produced in small numbers, using examples of the Bordkanone heavy-caliber aviation autocannon series which required the omission of the bowler undernose gondola for clearance. The prototype, derived from a standard Ju-88A4, was armed with a 7.5 cm anti-tank gun derived from the 7.5 cm PaK-40 installed in a large conformal gun pod under the fuselage. This was followed by a small batch of Ju-88P1, which standardized the solid sheet metal nose of the C version for all known examples of the P series, and used the new 7.5 cm PaK-40L semi-automatic gun, also known as the Bordkanone BK-7-5, which was also meant for use in both the later Henschel HS-129B3 dedicated anti-armor aircraft, and a never-achieved production version of the He-177A3 R5 ground attack flak suppression Stalingrad Topfield improvised version. The Ju-88P1 was produced in some 40 units, but with the massive cannon installed installation, resulting in a slow and vulnerable aircraft. It was soon replaced by the Ju-88P2, featuring two board-cannon 3.7 cm beak A3-7 guns, whose higher muzzle velocity proved useful against the Russian tanks in the Eastern Front. This aircraft was used by Airprobing's Commando 25. The Ju-88P3 also used the twin beak A3-7 guns, and added further armor for the crew, and was delivered at one Staffel of the Nachschlaggruppen 1, 2, 4, 8 and 9 for night attacks in the Eastern Front, in northern Norway and Italy. Finally, the Ju-88P4 mounted a smaller volume ventral gun pod housing of 5 cm auto-loading board cannon beak A5 cannon and, in some cases, 6.5 cm solid propellant rockets. Heavy fighter night fighter. Ju-88C. The Ju-88C was originally intended as a fighter bomber and heavy fighter by adding fixed, forward-firing guns to the nose while retaining some bomb-carrying ability of the A-series bomber. The C-series had a solid metal nose and retained the A-series style vertical tail, as well as the ventral bowler gondola under the crew compartment, although this was sometimes removed at unit level in order to reduce weight and drag and thus enhance aircraft performance. The Ju-88C was later used as a night fighter, and this became its main role. The first night fighter version of the Ju-88 was the C2, based on the A1 and armed with one 20mm MG-FF cannon and three 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns placed in a new metal nose. These examples entered service in Zerstorer Staffel of KG-30, and the unit was renamed to NJG-1 in July 1940. The C-6B version was the C-6 Zerstorer plane equipped with FUG-202 Liechtenstein B-Silo UHF band airborne intercept radar, using the complex 32 dipole Matratza antennas. The first four C-6B fighters were tested in early 1942 by NJG-1. The trials were successful and the aircraft was ordered into production. In October 1943, many C-6Bs were upgraded with new radar systems. The first new radar equipment was the FUG-212 Liechtenstein C-1. After the UHF band Liechtenstein radars had been compromised to the Allies in the late spring of 1943, the next development in German AI radar was the VHF band FUG-220 Liechtenstein SN2. Discarding the 32 dipole Matratza antennae for the much larger 8 dipole Hirschgewei aerials are required for the longer wavelength SN2 system. Many Ju-88Cs had the bowler gondolas modified to hold up to 3 forward-firing machine guns a cannon, the rear gondola gun position being eliminated. In addition, several night fighters were equipped with 2 Schrage Music upward-firing 20mm cannon in trial fittings, and from mid-1943 onward, there was an official field modification kit available for this arrangement. A small number of the C-series day fighters had the new solid metal noses specially painted to resemble the bomber A-series Beetle's Eye, faceted clear-view nose glazing, in an attempt to deceive Allied pilots into thinking the fighters were actually bombers. The unusual camouflage attempt did result initially in a number of Allied aerial losses. Ju-88R. The Ju-88R series night fighters were basically versions of the Ju-88 C6, powered by unitized BMW 801 radial engines. The R1 had had 1,560 PS BMW-801L engines and the R2 had 1,700 PS BMW-801 G2 engines. One of the first aircraft from the R1 series that went into service was involved in one of the most significant defections which the Luftwaffe suffered. On the 9th of May 1943, this night fighter, which was stationed with 10 NJG-3 in Aalborg, Denmark, flew to the RAF station at Dice with its entire crew and complete electronic equipment on board. The fact that Spitfire VB fighters No. 165 Squadron escorted it towards the end of its flight could indicate that its arrival had been expected. It was immediately transferred to Farnborough Airfield, received RAF markings and serial, and was tested in great detail. The preserved aircraft is on exhibit at the RAF Museum as one of the first two intact Ju-88s in aviation museums. The Luftwaffe only learned of this defection the following month when members of the crew, pilot Oberleutnant Heinrich Schmidt and Oberfeldwebel Paul Rosenberger, made broadcasts on British radio. The third crew member, Eric Cantwell, refused to cooperate with the British and was treated as a normal prisoner of war. Ju-88G. All previous night fighter versions of the Ju-88 used a modified A-series fuselage. The G-series fuselage was purpose-built from the special needs of a night fighter, with the A-series bolaventral undernose defensive gun position omitted for lower aerodynamic drag and less weight, and adding the enlarged squared-off vertical fin rudder tail unit of the Ju-188. G1 aircraft possessed more powerful armament and, like the earlier R1, used a pair of 1,700 PS BMW-801 radial engines, the G1 using the later BMW-801 G2 version. Electronic equipment consisted of the then standard FUG 220 Liechtenstein SN2 90 MHz VHF radar using 8-dipole Herschel antennas, which could include fitment of the borderline SHF band FUG 350 Naxos radar detector with its receiving antenna housed in a teardrop-shaped, streamlined fairing above the canopy, or FUG 227 Flensburg radar detector homing devices that had their own trio of twin dipole antennae, one on each wing leading edge and one under the tail. One Ju-88G1 of 7 Staffel NJG2 was flown by mistake to RAF Woodbridge in July 1944, giving the Royal Air Force its first chance to check out the VHF band Liechtenstein SN2 radar and Flensburg radar detector gear. G6 versions were equipped with 1,750 PS Ju-Mode 213A inline V12 engines, enlarged fuel tanks and often one or two 20mm MG 151/20 cannons in a Schrage music installation. These guns were pointed obliquely upwards and forwards from the upper fuselage, usually at an angle of 70 degrees. Some of the final G-series models received updates to the engines, using a pair of high-altitude Ju-Mode 213E inverted V12s with the same revised annular radiator design as the 213 as already used, or to the radar, using the mid-VHF band FUG 218 Neptune AI radar with either the standardized Herschel aerials with shorter dipoles to suit the higher frequencies used, or more rarely the advanced Morgenstern 90 degrees crossed element 6-dipole Yagi form antenna. Only a very few Ju-88G6 night fighters were ever fitted with the semi-experimental FUG 240 Berlin N1 cavity magnetron-based 3 GHz band radar, whose dish antenna was housed in a smoothly contoured radome on the G6's nose. Only about 15 of the Berlin systems were completed before VE Day. Many Luftwaffe night fighter aces, such as Helmut Lent and Heinrich Prinz zu Sein-Wittgenstein, flew Ju-88s during their careers. The Imperial Japanese Navy ordered the specifications of an anti-submarine patrol escort fleet aircraft, based on a medium bomber. Kyushu closely patterned the Kyushu Q-1W Tokai anti-submarine patrol fleet escort aircraft after the Ju-88.